Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon, and greetings from the Nunavik Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clement Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Institute, which has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. Welcome to our flash panel on the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. I want to thank Notre Dame's Jerusalem Global Gateway and its executive director, Daniel Schweke, who had reached out with the idea of putting a panel together. I also want to thank the Krog Institute for International Peace Studies for collaborating on this event. We are faced with a dramatic tragedy after the devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake in Syria and Turkey. More than 30,000 people have died. Bishop Paolo Bizzetti, Apostolic Vicar of Anatolia, had made the observation that the earthquake was a tragedy within a tragedy, since the region is already full of refugees from various countries who have fled terrible situations. Even though words can never be the appropriate response to such a disaster, we want to contribute to their response by trying to understand the background and relevant facts, consequences, and implications. It is an exercise in trying to make sense and also an exercise in acknowledging that this tragedy demands our attention, understanding, and concern. We are trying to understand the human dimension. This 1-hour panel will be moderated by Avram Burg, a political writer and peace activist, former speaker of the Knesset, and faculty member of the University of Notre Dame's Jerusalem Global Gateway. He will introduce the panel and the panelists. Dear Avram, thank you so much. May I please hand over to you?
Clemens, thank you very much. There are mornings like this that you wake up in the morning and you know that the world will never be the same. The pillars of Earth collapse, and between nature and humans, between environment and engineering, between the actuality and politics, the ripple effects are never just the play itself. What happened in Syria and in Turkey is one of those events, one of these mornings that we always remember. And we at the Global Gateway of Notre Dame in the region, we love Turkey, we care about Syria, and we care about any humanitarian distress or any humanitarian need around. We're very, very concerned, and we would like to understand. And we try tonight to share it, the understanding, the comprehension, to share it among ourselves and to share it with our audiences and the people participate. We shall try to work in concentric circles from the inner Turkish to the wider historical and political, and to the regional and global geopolitical situation. So let's start with a very quick round of 1 minute, more or less up to date from what do you know is happening around. The first will be Shahrazad Mat, a Turkish originally, now at Notre Dame in South Bend in America, and an expert about this. Shahrazad, what's going on there daily? What do you know recently?
Hi, everyone. So right now, of course, as you all know, the situation is really challenging on the ground. There are more than 13 million who have been affected in Turkey by the earthquake. There are, according to the Ministry of Urbanization's report from earlier today, there are over 50,000 buildings that collapsed. There are over 100,000 buildings that were damaged. And one of the things that is very important to think about right now is the overly bureaucratic and centralistic approach to emergency response in Turkey is slowing down rescue and relief efforts, has slowed down these efforts in the past week. Volunteers from the region are reporting that they spent hours on the first day waiting for the necessary signatures before they could actually start their rescue and search missions. Some groups, some teams were told to go to sleep because of the lack of coordination, and nobody knew how to assign responsibilities. So this struck, and at the same time, the centralist approach obstructed.
Let's let's sit here for a second. You'll come back to that in your main introduction. Dr. Ahmad Öztürk, also a Turk from another part of Turkey, an expert about politics and international relationship. Ahmad, what do you know? What do you see? What is your taking over the immediate?
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. I think it's great to discuss this stuff while everything is very hot. I mean, Shehrazad gave the numbers. What I know, I mean, this issue, as of now, we know according to the official numbers, more than 36,000 people passed away. And this is a tragic number because
both Turkey and Syria, right?
No, I'm only talking about Turkey because we couldn't get the real number because of the political instability from Syria, but I'm talking about Turkey. And the other thing is that, I mean, right now, yes, there is one geographical issue. I mean, the number of the deaths, the number of the injured, the people who will affect from this earthquake, this shocking earthquake. But at the same time, as a Turkey, which is a very important country in the region and globally, we have been talking about whether this geographical issue is a destiny, this is a geographical natural disaster, or this is a disaster of politics, because what we know, that's one of the main topics that has been discussed.
Stop it here, Ahmed. Stop it here. Okay, Gabi, you are now in Jerusalem, right? Which is a kind of, on one hand, an observation, I mean, a point of view, but not immediately on the spot. What is your taking of the immediacy?
So I'm just going to give one anecdote that I think is in theme with what I'll be talking about later, which is that today, for the first time in 30 years, the land boundary and border between Armenia and Turkey was opened. Wow. And the Armenian foreign minister made a formal visit to his counterpart in Ankara. Those of you in the audience who understand the symbolic nature of that gesture, given the long-standing historical grievances and contemporary grievances between those two countries, can understand and appreciate how significant a gesture that was, and how that reflects the gravity and the seriousness of what took place over the last week.
So what we have here is, on the ground, chaotic bureaucracy, cries for need and chaotic bureaucracy, larger political question of what does that mean? Is it negligence or is it a destiny? And we have a regional reshuffle of situations that we have to monitor. This is actually what we take from ground zero. So let's go into our introduction. Shehrazad, take us to what you see the complexities of the reality out there, please.
Okay, so I want to focus on two main things to kind of understand what's happening right now and what was the history of, the process, how we came today, and what we should be doing, thinking about the reconstruction process. So first of all, I'll talk about the earthquake preparedness framework that has been used as an economic and political tool in Turkey. So on the paper, the Turkish government in the past 2 decades have developed an extensive legal and bureaucratic earthquake preparedness framework to reconstruct areas at risk across the country. But when we look at the practice, the government deploys urban transformation and this earthquake preparedness framework primarily as an economic tool to sustain the regime. So one of the laws central to earthquake preparedness framework is 6306. This law gives the Ministry of Urbanization rights to evacuate and reconstruct areas at earthquake risk. But this law has been used over and over again to demolish the neighborhoods of marginalized and minoritized communities and to forcefully evacuate them from urban centers. In turn, as you can imagine, upper scale commercial residential areas are often built in these evacuated urban lands. Turkey is not an exceptional or exotic case in that sense. We're all familiar with the story of neoliberalization, no matter what city we come from. What's really daunting, though, is that the legal and organizational framework, this earthquake preparedness framework, was necessary in Turkey. Experts have been cautioning against earthquake risks for decades, yet earthquake preparedness became a strategic tool for economic growth and subjugation. Another law, for example, that was central to the Turkish government's urban policies and to this earthquake preparedness framework is the zoning amnesty law. So through this law, citizens can apply for permits for structures that were originally built without the necessary permits, without proof that construction followed standards set by regulations. So, and this law cites preparations for earthquakes, for disasters, to justify the after the fact provision of these permits, saying that then citizens, through these citizen applications, basically, the ministry will have a better understanding of which buildings are at risk, it'll be easier to identify them, etc. So right before the 2019 local elections, in a rally in Hatay, Erdogan referred to this zoning amnesty law, saying that his government solved a problem for 205,000 citizens in the city. And today, when we look at Hatay, it's one of the cities that has been hit the hardest by the earthquake. So every once in a while, the government accepts a new cycle of applications for zoning amnesties. And this is a selling point for the party, especially around election times. In fact, if the earthquakes didn't happen, the renewal of the amnesty law was about to be discussed at the parliament to receive a new term of applications right in time for the upcoming May elections in Turkey. And the fees and fines collected through these applications are also a massive source of income for the government. So according to some data from the Turkish Statistical Institute, the government collected approximately $87 million worth of fees from these applications. Same for earthquake taxes. In the past 2 decades, the government collected over $38 billion just in earthquake taxes. So it's unclear at the moment how this money contributed to disaster prevention or response, right?
So actually you say, we have the experience of the previous earthquakes, we have policies, we have regulations, but somehow, whether it's corruption or inefficiency, at the moment of truth, it failed.
Right. Yeah. And you know, part of it is corruption. It's important to talk about corruption because like some companies and public officials overlooked aberrations from the law and construction regulations for their own political and economic gains. Again, like statistics tell us right now that over 52% of the buildings that collapsed in the region were built according to these updated construction regulations following the 99 earthquake.
You have a feeling that people out there with all the miseries and all the needs and the terrible cold and the hunger and victims, etc., they already feel the political meaning of it?
Of course, certainly. And right now it's a challenge on the ground because on the one hand, there's a lot of frustration. People have lost families, properties, but on the other hand, the media has not been perfect in its representation of the situation. And it's been very challenging for people to actually express their frustrations because of the political repression at the moment, because we're approaching really fast to an election, right? To a national election. So the government and a lot of state organizations are trying to manage how the situation is represented.
Thank you, Shahrazad. I'll stop you here. We'll talk about later. I mean, it was a very, very, I think, clear and courageous description of what not necessarily is well discussed in the Turkish media itself. And I think there is no better point to move to Ahmet and actually to go to the second circle around it, okay? The socio-political implications of the earthquake.
Well, I think, Shahrazad concluded in a very great point. I think, as I said at the very beginning of my speech, as an associate professor of politics, I can't read this situation as a natural disaster. I mean, this is totally a political disaster, and it is impossible for anyone to see that this is coming. I think at this level, I want to analyze this issue within the 3 points. What happened before the earthquake, the failed state image of Turkey during the earthquake and what would happen after the earthquake. The first thing is that, I mean, before the earthquake, I think all of this lack of capabilities to fight against the disaster is partially because of the authoritarian transformation of the country roughly after 2011. Because Turkish understanding of authoritarianism is quite different than compared to the the Asian or the Eastern style of authoritarianism. I mean, Turkish type of authoritarianism is, I'm defining this situation as a Alaturka type of presidency. I mean, it is not only a one-man rule, also it is a kind of a neo-patrimonial understanding of the authoritarianism. What does it mean that, for example, Shehrazad talk about some companies very close to the government or palace or directly to the president? This means that you are not responsible to obey any single rule. That means that this is the corruption. That means that this is the constructing the buildings in a cheap way, in a quick way, so on and so forth. And the other thing is that, I mean, one of the main election mottos of Erdogan, who is an election machine, he has been winning every single election more than 2 decades in Turkey right now, not doing roads or the buildings, houses in a solid way, but instead in a quick way. I mean, and we know that like more than 55% of the Turkey's geographical land is an earthquake land. It's not important to make, it is not important how you make all of these buildings in a quick way, but it is important how you make these buildings in a stronger way, or like resistance against the earthquake. This is the first part. I mean, authoritarianism, neo-patrimonial governments, and one-man rule, Alaturka presidency is one of the backbones of this disaster. This is the first point. The second point is that, I mean, despite of everything, Turkey is or was a solid state with strong institutions. I mean, with a long, even though it's a little bit of a broken parliamentary democracy, so on and so forth. And Turkey has been experiencing a lot of earthquakes over the last century. But this means that all the institutions should have a praxis to act rapidly. But what we saw that because of every single issue based on one man, in the critical initial hours and the days after the last Monday's earthquake, the Erdogan government was extremely slow off the mark. In particularly, I mean, the region is quite complicated. It has been affected more than 10 cities. It is impossible to act to the region with the civil organization. I mean, that kind of huge
civil society.
Sorry?
You mean the civil society?
Civil society or some governmental institutions. But instead, Turkish military can easily act and can easily save many more lives. But we know that Erdogan didn't give an order within the first 3 days, and nobody knows that why he didn't do that. The other thing is that, I mean, after this horrifying issue, what we know that it will affect most probably more than 13 million people in Turkey. In a televised speech to the nation, Erdogan declared a state of emergency and the week of national mourning. That is fine. But at the same time, after he spoke like a couple of minutes about the disaster, about the state of emergency, he started to target the individuals, the institutions who criticize his decisions or the state's slow act. So even though after this horrifying disaster, he used this issue to polarize the society at the same time and to create the new victims and enemies. So this means that even though within this critical situation, he also uses this part as a political tool. I mean, there is always the lack of a state support, and I mean, Turkey acted as a failed state. Go ahead, I think you have a question.
Ahmad, earthquake frames, in a way, what you argue, that the earthquake frames Erdogan regime or government. He actually, when he took over 20 years ago, so it was with the background of the late 90s earthquake, and he came and said, I'll do it better. Because then the disaster was because nothing was regulated, nothing was correctly built. And now, 20 years later, it looks like back to square one. He's like the previous regime.
Definitely, precisely. And I mean, this is a very ordinary comment that has been doing in Turkey right now, and it brings up to a big question. Will this earthquake bring the end of an Erdogan area? Because I mean, according to the Financial Times, as you know, this year is the 2023 is the election year in Turkey, and it has been defined as one of the most important issues in the world politics, because it may be end of a 20 years Erdogan regime in Turkey. But as I said, I mean, Erdogan is in an Aristotelian concept, he's a political animal. He is one of the most experienced political leader if you don't consider Joe Biden's age, because if I'm not mistaken, Erdogan is 69 years old right now, and he has been in politics since he's 13. He has been in the youth club, he has been the mayor of Istanbul, prime minister. He worked and he has experience in every stage of the politics. He knows politics very well. And he realized that after this election, after this earthquake, and on top of that, Turkish economy has been in a shrinking conditions quite a long time. People are not happy. There is a new wave of migration from Turkey to the West, so on and so forth. Erdogan does not have a big chance to get the election under the normal circumstances. Now we are in an exceptional situation, and it seems that it is impossible for Erdogan to win the election. And according to the constitution, you can only postpone the elections under one circumstances: war. But this is indeed not a war, but he is planning to postpone the elections, and within this, postpone the election 1 year. And my question is that what he will do in this year to win the election. So I think this earthquake will open a new chapter.
Ahmed, you challenge here something which is fantastic in every political system, and this is the skills of the leader and the memory of the people. Definitely. So let's see who will win. Will it be May? It was supposed to be June. Then he made it earlier for May. He maybe will defer it a little bit later. Let's see. But it's we understand. I mean, what your argument, your main argument is, it is a very heavily saturated with politics. It's Definitely. Not just a disaster, it's also a huge political disaster for some.
Yeah, and this, I mean, the earthquake was followed by more than 2,000 aftershocks. But politically, we will see many more aftershocks over the next year, most probably.
Gabi, aftershocks is your expertise, right? I have only one request, Gabi. I mean, as painful as it is and as fascinating as it is, Turkey is not alone here. So open up a little bit the windows to the region in general, and if you can, to the refugees and Syria in particular, please.
So one of the things that is important to remind our audience, for those who are not familiar, that Turkey, along with its neighbors, sits on several fault lines, and as has been mentioned by some of the other panelists, the earthquake and the area of the disaster not only affected Turkey, but also affected Syria. Syria, which has been for the last 10 years engaged in a bloody civil war and is under multiple sanction regimes and doesn't have the same degree of infrastructure. If we were going to, talk about how it's very easy to criticize Turkey or the Turkish government for the steps that they didn't take over the last several decades to prepare for the earthquake, all the more so in Syria. There is a complete lack of infrastructure and lack of clear mechanisms for international actors to provide aid, relief, etc., because there is no centralized government, and portions of the area that's been affected by the earthquake are actually under Turkish military control, right? And so the questions about Syria are far more difficult to define than the questions that exist in Turkey, both because of media access and because of our just ability to get a clear understanding of what's going on the ground. But for the countries in the region, what happened in Turkey was a reminder that it could have very easily happened to them as well. And at least from a geological perspective, eventually it will happen, right? Maybe in this century or in the next. But that's the fortune or the misfortune of sitting on a fault line in the Earth's crust. I want to kind of pinpoint a couple of important things. First, I mentioned an example that I thought was in many ways inspiring, right? That the Armenian-Turkish border had been reopened for the first time in 30 years, and that the Armenian foreign minister paid a visit out of respect, I believe, and sympathy to his Turkish counterpart. That's been matched by the actions of other actors in the region who also have historical grievances with Turkey. That includes Greece, that includes Cyprus. And I think that, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is why or how is it possible that in a region that has so many long-standing grievances and political disputes, were all these actors able to put those issues to the side for the sake of helping one another in a humanitarian crisis? But when it comes to banal engagement, those tensions reemerge. They're fraught with suspicion. Why is it that only in these kinds of moments are the political issues set to the side for the sake of helping out one in need? Within the region itself, earthquakes aren't the only natural issues that political actors or international actors are dealing with. It's also a climate change hotspot. And so while there's an ad hoc crisis management mechanism in the region, perhaps this event, as tragic as it is, can galvanize the actors of the region to develop some kind of multinational mechanism for crisis prevention and disaster relief. But I think that one of the things that we need to recognize, for those who have been paying attention on the news and hearing stories of the rescue teams finding people in the wreckage, even as late as today, a full week after the earthquake, we need to understand and appreciate the fact that with over 40,000 dead, that this earthquake has already surpassed the number of casualties in the conflict in Ukraine, right? And over 1.2 million people are homeless at the very least, right? With no clear path of a future. So the rehabilitation of this region is going to take decades, and that the efforts can't just be in the short term, but it also has to be medium and long term as well.
Gabi, we should walk into the opening you just opened, but a rebound question, a follow-up question, okay? We heard from Shahrazad and from Ahmed that there is a lot of politics in Turkey itself, but the feeling is somehow, at least from our limited point of view, you send aid and somehow it arrives. After all the bureaucracy and roadblocks, etc., it arrives. There is a feeling that in Syria, the inner politics of Syria also impacts who gets aid and who is not. So talk a little bit for a second, and then it's open for all of us about the politics of aid.
Well, there's politics when it comes to the distribution of aid, regardless of what the circumstances of the humanitarian crisis may be. So what I'm going to say isn't going to be particularly different now that there's been an earthquake than the past 10 years in which there have been international efforts to deliver aid within Syria because of the complexities of and the context of the civil war. It will be equally challenging for agencies, whether they be state agencies, NGOs, whether they be Turkish or international, to deliver aid effectively and efficiently within Turkey itself. How does one distribute aid? Who receives aid first? Who receives it last? We're talking about a region in southeastern Turkey where there are also hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Syrian refugees who fled Syria during the civil war and have been residing within Turkey. They're not citizens, but residing within Turkey. And I think that, once again, with the number of homeless, with the number of people who no longer have a shelter to go to, the question will be, where will they go next? Will they go to the major cities in Anatolia or in Istanbul, which have been flooded over the last decade already with refugees from the region? And so will they then continue to Europe and essentially restart the cycle of geopolitical tensions between Turkey and its European neighbors, because there just isn't capacity to provide those types of basic human services for that quantity of people within the time frame that it's going to be needed.
We'll do Europe in a second, but first, thank you very much, all of you, Shahrazad and Ahmad and Gabi, about the multifaceted introduction to the reality. Here is a question which comes, I will say, from somebody who was engaged but very painful. Hawla Wakaf is a student of, is a Syrian graduate student here at Notre Dame. She is also a JSD candidate in the Notre Dame Law School, Kellogg doctoral fellow, etc. Very impressive individual coming from Syria, okay? And she asks a very, I would say, generic question or general one. I'd like each and every one of you to address it briefly. What are the steps that the international community, from its point of view, not from the prism of the local, not from the interest groups and pressures that each and every system has, but what should be the international community must take to make sure that the people of Syria, and I'll add Turkey, are not hostage of the politics that divided the country for the last 12 years. So in Syria is actual and bleeding. According to Ahmad and Shahrazad in Turkey, it's hidden and covert, but it is there as well. So the question is, now I send my money, I Europe, I America, I Armenia. I send my money. How do I make sure that the money gets to the needy?
This is a great question, actually. And may I, if you don't mind?
Please.
I mean, about Turkey, again, there has been a discussion because on the one hand, state has been collecting donations. And on the other hand, there are a couple of civil society organizations run by like famous singers, artists, I mean, the theater players, so on and so forth. I mean, most of the individuals, for example, Madonna, or for example, Lionel Messi, they're not sending their donations to the state institutions. They've been sending it to the civil society institutions because of this authoritarian neo-parliamentarianism corruption. They do not have any single trust to the current Turkish government. On the other hand, World Bank announced that it's open to donate $1.8 billion, but not to the central government, only municipalities based on projects. I mean, these are very clear indicator about the lack of trust to the current regime in Turkey. So this is the one point. The other point is that, I mean, now, if I'm not mistaken, it's the 8 days of the, or 8 or the 9 days of the earthquake. And I think international society has been giving a great effort regarding Turkey, because while Turkey's state institutions were not capable to support the region very well, we saw many Western countries run very fastly to save the injured ones or trying to save the individuals under the buildings. Even though since 2015, 2016, Erdogan's government turned its face from west to east and claimed the Eastern Club as a Western Christian traitor clubs, quote unquote, on the populist discourse, the Western society, Western states were the first one who run to help to Turkey. So I think as of now, the world society has been doing a great job and they've been doing as much as they can do.
Shahrazad?
Can I add to that?
Sure.
So I think one issue, and this was especially critical in the first few days, was that there were towns, neighborhoods that weren't reached at all by the central government or even civil society organizations, let alone international community. And during that time, it was especially challenging for any kind of donation or aid to be received by these neighborhoods, by these towns, where people had to kind of mobilize their own resources, their own bodies to save their loved ones. And at that time, especially the centralist approach in Turkey was very, like, making things very challenging, because then there were all these groups on the ground who could help, but they were not allowed to gather donations. They were not allowed to actually coordinate any sort of relief efforts. So then it was up to individuals to reach out to people they know in those neighborhoods and to receive their bank account information to kind of make those transactions individually that were not regulated through civil society organizations or the central government. And I think, this is still an issue because of the centralist approach, that there are groups of people who aren't receiving, whether it's coming from the international community or civil society, whatnot, they're not receiving the necessary support.
Gabi.
I think that as a basic principle, the important thing is trust, but verify. If you're going to donate money, and I do think that one of the most effective ways of contributing to both the rescue and long-term relief efforts is to donate money as opposed to goods and materials, that if you're going to donate money, donate it to something or someone that you trust. Someone that you know is a trusted voice on what's going on in Turkey or what's going on in Syria, or a known organization within your own home country that you know has people on the ground engaged in those activities. But then to go beyond that, to verify, to keep following the relief efforts in order to understand and better understand where your money is going to and what kind of impact it's making. Because the trickle-down effect is a long one. It's going to take a very long time. And so I think that, while in the first week, it's inspiring. And of course, the phrase of, you save one life is like saving an entire world. And that is true, right? But there are many, many more lives who are going to be at risk in the future, not because of the earthquake, but because of the aftermath of the earthquake, because they don't have homes, because they don't have access to basic needs like food and medicine, right? And so, the numbers that we're looking at when we talk about casualties and death are just about the incident itself, right? But the aftermath of that is much more significant. So I think that it's all about, giving to organizations that you trust, but then continuing to be invested in what's happening and verifying that the money that you've put into that process is making a difference.
Thanks. I'd like to revisit something that Ahmed said earlier when he was a geologist for a second, and he said every shock has an aftershock. And I'd like to talk about the aftershock. Okay, we have an immediate crisis. It's about tents and hospitals and aid and food and rescue and you name it. But then look at the numbers. I mean, the last decade, million refugees, first from Syria and later on from some other places, put a huge pressure on Europe. Million people almost brought the European Union to its knees. Nobody paid attention that the same number of people were being hosted in poor Jordan from both the war in Iraq, or the fall in Iraq, and from the Syrian war alone. And 4 million people, if not more, are refugees in Turkey from the Syrian war. Now, all of a sudden, we have the 4 million plus 2 to 3 million people within Syria itself, if not more, who are exiles in their own country, plus now these millions. What kind of pressures do we expect at the following places? Between states in the region, on the big cities. How will Istanbul look like? Because everybody in a situation like this goes to the next city, to the place which looks, can provide. And then what does that mean to the West? I mean, I don't know. I'm not at all sure that this time Erdogan will be able to control the locks, the gates, to prevent these millions to flood Europe. So how do we have to get ready within Turkey, within Syria, between states in the region, and then between the region and the immediate next neighbor, which is the richer Europe?
If I may.
You can always make.
Thank you so much. I mean, first is first. If I were you, I wouldn't be very sure when I'm talking about Erdogan. He may do some tricks. This is the first thing. But the other thing is that, I mean, you are precisely right. The first thing is that migrating from the region to Istanbul or to Ankara is risky in many ways. I mean, first of all, economically, these cities are not capable to welcome any newcomers. The second thing is that, according to the geophysicist, the next big earthquake will be in Istanbul. And currently Istanbul, unofficially around 20 million. And according to the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, more than 58% of the buildings needs to be rebuilt or resupported for the earthquake. So this means that if there will be 7.8 earthquake in Istanbul, this will be an independence question about Turkey, most probably in terms of economy, in terms of aid. This is the first thing. The other thing is that, I mean, yes, you know, there is a wave of migration from Syria to Turkey, but at the same time, there is, I mean, we have been dealing another issue, new Turkeys, new migrants in Europe, because particularly after the Gezi protest and after the coup attempt, we saw more than 3.5 million Turkish originated individuals. They are like middle class, well-educated people trying to migrate to Europe for a better future, for a secure life in terms of many other things. And I mean, as a person who has been living in Europe more than a decade, I can easily observe that Europe is not also capable to welcome many more Turks. And these newcomers also creating another socio-political issue in Europe, because we have been observing an increasement of the right-wing political waves in Europe. It happened in Sweden, it happened in Italy, it may probably happen in the UK in the near future, so on and so forth. I mean, and this anti-Turks propaganda is one of the main discourses of this newly increasing right-wing politics. So this earthquake aftershock will go through the West in the very near future, from my point of view.
Gabi and then Shahrazad.
So I think that one of the big questions is going to be, you know, as has often been the case in Turkey, in particular under Erdogan, is how will Turkish foreign policy change or manifest itself as a result of this earthquake? The conservative estimates is that the earthquake rehabilitation or rebuilding will cost an estimated $90 billion. And I say that it's conservative because how can we actually know what the cost is going to be only 9 days in? But it will take decades of work. And so Turkey is going to have a lot of difficult, challenging choices to make. If the first decade of Erdogan's rule was about zero problems with neighbors, and the second decade of Erdogan's rule was many problems with many neighbors, then will this earthquake quicken a return to a more cooperative Turkey? Will it be more cooperative towards the European Union and more cooperative towards the United States? How will it impact its relationship with the IMF and the World Bank? Erdogan, at least in recent years, has had a huge issue with interest rates, but this might be a situation in which he may need to be more conciliatory. I also think that it raises serious questions about Turkey's continued role in Syria. And while it isn't actively involved on the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine, it has played a really important role in brokering between Ukraine and Russia, and in fact, supplying military arms to Ukraine as well. Will the Turkish military industrial complex be ramped up as a way to offset costs? And who will Turkey sell those materials to in order to balance out the books over the course of its coming decades? So it raises a lot of questions without any answers.
What about Syria? This is Turkey, but let's not forget that we have another sister of suffering.
With Syria, the guess what? The civil war is going to continue. That's the bad news, right? And I think that, you know, as there were rescue efforts in Turkey, there were far fewer rescue efforts or initiatives or even capacity to rescue people from the fallen buildings in Syria. I don't think that in any way, shape, or form it's going to impact the current geopolitical stalemate that exists on the ground. But like I said, I do think that there's a question about, in particular, Turkey's continued role in Syria. And I think that if we're going to see any kind of change within the construct of what currently exists in Syria, it will be there, either a more cooperative Turkey, a Turkey that wants to remove itself from northern Syria, or a Turkey that reasserts itself or asserts itself even more strongly or more forcefully in northern Syria in order to meet some of its domestic goals. But the civil war in Syria is not going to end, and a lot of the aid-related issues about delivering aid to that area are going to continue to persist due to the fact of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of trust with the Assad regime, and the very fact that the actors who are supporting the Assad regime, both Iran and Russia, are also not favored by the international community. So the mechanisms to deliver aid into Syria are very, very narrow. And the easiest way to deliver aid into Syria is through Turkey. And Turkey's needs are inevitably going to come first.
Shahrazad, the aftershock of the shock. Shahrazad, your turn.
Sorry, my internet is cutting up, but yeah, right now I know that the government has a plan to move people who were displaced in the region to to dorms, college dorms on the west side of the country, which is a highly debated topic right now. Why prioritizing the space that educational institutions has, rather than maybe like leaning onto hotels or other sorts of institutions that could open up that space. So that's already a controversial issue in Turkey. But in terms of the reconstruction of the region, I think the civil society, the national community, and any sort of political opposition group needs to be in the lookout right now for the reconstruction plans, because the Turkish government, especially in the southeastern region of Turkey, where the earthquake hit, has a track record of using post-disaster and post-conflict reconstruction as a tool to gentrify Kurdish cities and as a tool to subjugate Kurdish people, to displace established socio-political opposition there with deep-seated know-how. So I think this is going to be important for the international community and civil society organizations to kind of look for, and we must all advocate for the full transparency, public accountability of these reconstruction plans, and we must advocate for the inclusion of local communities. And I think this will be the case both in Turkey and Syria. So during the reconstruction, we must keep an eye out for the inclusion of communities to prevent further dispossession and further displacement in the region.
I would like, with your permission, before we move into the wrap-up round, with one stupid question and one fearful question. The stupid one is it possible that the international institutions are ill-equipped for this kind of a challenge? Let's call it the UN is about wars, conflicts, political and national collisions, but this is a natural disaster. It happened at the Philippines, it happened at the tsunami in Thailand, it happens here. Is it possible that under the current state of global warming and climate challenge that we have, that we need different setting of international institutions to deal with it differently beside politics? That's a stupid question. The other one is both regions, at least, I mean, Turkey, Syria, I'm a little bit less know of it, are very traditional vis-a-vis less modern, more religious, etc., etc. Is it possible that this kind of a disaster will be an opening for more fundamentalist and more political Islam and political extremism to take over and to push even further than where we are today under Erdogan? Gabi, Shahrazad, Ahmad, you are last now.
Okay.
So I think that, it's difficult to say what the human response to such a tragedy may be, and that it's better to ask that question in maybe 10, 15, 20 years to understand the real scope and the impact of a tragedy like that on the people that it affected, the people who lost families, who lost their homes, who lost their future, and what kind of rehabilitation will take place in the region. So I can't answer the second question. It's a little too fresh, I think, and it's hard to predict. But when it comes to the international community, I think that we're operating in a current global condition where there are a lot of fires, both real and imagined, and there's a tremendous amount of polarization and a multipolar space where there are limited resources and limited capacity for the international community to respond to each and every crisis in the same level and with the same desire. When it comes to responding to a humanitarian crisis like an earthquake, yes, there are sufficient mechanisms and the sufficient number of organizations to respond to this. And Turkey, less so than Syria, but Turkey in and of itself is a very strong economic country with a very robust civil society that will respond probably very positively to this kind of tragedy and try to move from it, right? So I don't think that that's the question. I think the real question is where will the resources go and how will they be distributed, and how will the international community continue to pay attention to what's going on in Turkey, and even more so in Syria, where it has less capacity, given the fact that its attention is also being drawn to other developments in other parts of the world. And so we're kind of in a situation where, like the Dutch boy, we're sticking our fingers trying to plug up all of these holes, but eventually there's going to be one hole in which the water continues to pour out, and we don't have the capacity to respond, right? So it might be this, or it might be in particular the effect of the earthquake in Syria, but the international community's biggest challenge right now is a lack of unity, just a complete fragmentation of the international structure that's existed for the last 70 years. And while it has the capacity to respond to a lot of crises, and it may be able to respond to this one, the next one, maybe we will fail.
Thank you very much. Shahrazad?
I agree with Gabriel. And, when it comes to international aid, I think what's going to be really important is the conditions under which these, relief efforts or aids are reaching Turkey or Syria, and how they're going to be used in the region. And in terms of the second question, well, I think that's a really hard question to answer, but my answer would be probably no, because the civil society, despite all the, oppression in the region at the moment, despite all the obstruction, is trying to be present and useful. Numerous established professional associations, social movement organizations are directing most of their resources to relief efforts at the moment. So this will have a lasting impact on the civic sphere in Turkey, considering the extent to which these organizations are dedicating their platforms and agendas to this cause. We're talking about feminist organizations, psychologists, lawyers associations, and so on, documenting the impact of the earthquake, filing criminal reports, collecting evidence from the rubble to keep public officials and contractors responsible, accountable for the destruction in the region. And they're, serving as translators between minorities, officials, and providing urgent socio-political support. So I think rather than thinking about like a fundamentalist turn or like, an extremist radical Islam, etc., I think what's important right now to pay attention to the fact that the civil society in Turkey, and I'm sure in Syria too, is bearing the brunt of the devastation and still working actively on the ground despite the obstructions to mobilize all of their networks and resources. I think that's what matters at the moment. And I'm hoping that that's the direction civil society will continue going in.
Ahmad, please.
For the first question, I would be very simple. I think the civil society should have an impact and a positive impact. But regarding the second question, according to the latest surveys regarding the level of the religiosity in Turkey, even though there has been a pro-Islamist government in Turkey, we have been observing the decrease of the level of religiosity. When you check the survey questions, the reasons behind that, because the current government, on the one hand, in a discursive level, they've been defining themselves as the Muslim, pro-Islamist, so on and so forth. But at the same time, we've been observing authoritarianism, corruption, so on and so forth. So this is an oxymoronic situation. And in this level, an Islamist government will not capable to support its citizens. So in this regard, I think instead of increasement of the fundamentalism or the religiosity, how the Shehrazad told that the secular civil society groups has much more impact in the region. We will see the decreasement of the religiosity in the region as well. And we should also consider that the majority of the region is coming from a pro-Kurdish or the Kurdish originated Turkistism, and they have been coming from the Alevi background, not the Sunni Islam. So I think the religion will not play a huge indicator within this situation right now.
Guys, we are at the last 2.5 minutes. Take a moment to think, and everybody has a sentence to wish to the region, to wish to the people, to wish to the nature even. Make a wish. Gabi, you go first.
Instead of giving a wish, I'll give a name of an organization. I'll point out, just for the sake of in Syria, you know, if you're interested in making an impact, to make an impact by looking up the website of the White Helmets, who were the most trusted organization for relief and search and rescue prior to the earthquake, and will continue to do that work in the earthquake's aftermath.
Ahmed?
Not only Turkey, not only Syria, the region has been suffering with many catastrophic issues, and all of these issues has been cutting each other like vertically and horizontally. And my wish for the region, first, justice for everyone, not for the privileged elite political actors, welfare, equal welfare for everyone. And I mean, this region needs a peace, at least for a while. Needs a peace in terms of everything. So I'll just wish justice, welfare, and peace for the region. Thank you so much.
Shahrazad?
I will also mention 2 organizations that are reliable to donate, like Gabi did. So first one is Ahbab in Turkey, which is a civil society organization that's working with all the necessary permissions on the ground. That's a reliable organization if you want to support. White Helmets also, I've heard, is a reliable one in Syria. And then in the Kurdistan region, which has been, you know, already a neglected area, Heva Asor Kurdistane is another reliable organization that could be supported. Yeah, and I wish, similarly as Ahmed, justice and peace to the region, which, you know, there are civil society organizations that are working towards this, and hopefully we'll see positive impacts from them.
Before thanking you all and give it back, the floor back to Clemens, I will say as follows. There is so much animosity in the region. It looks like everybody has at least one enemy. And all of a sudden, the nature reacted. The nature should not be an enemy, though it's very costly, but it might or should, this is my prayer, will become a unifier, that people will understand that there are greater forces than the immediate passion and the immediate hatred or the immediate interest. And the kind of cooperation needed for rescue eventually will be the same cooperation with the contribution of our watchers, with the donation of the international community, with the civil society on ground, with the wishful vision of Ahmed, that the people invest into building a better region and therefore a better future for all of us. For a tortured, iconic place, it will become an icon of a better humanity. Thank you very much. Clemens, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Avram, for masterfully moderating this panel. Thank you all for creating a space to listen and to think. We learned a lot. Thank you, dear panelists, Shahrazad, Ahmed, Gabriel, for your substantial discussions. We want to thank the audience for your interest and your care. Let me again express my gratitude to Notre Dame's Jerusalem Global Gateway and the Krog Institute for International Peace Studies for collaborating on this panel. I would also like to thank our colleagues who made this panel possible, especially Tim Checkley, Grant Osborne, Grania McEvoy, and Becca Prince. Words will never suffice as a response, but we hope that today's panel has provided not only food for thought, but also some thoughts for action. Let us also pray for the victims of the disaster and their families, May God give us the gift of tears to overcome any indifference and a clear mind to read the signs of the times. Thank you very much. All good wishes from the Nanovic Institute here at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you all.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.